It read like a blueprint for a criminal empire. The Detroit Free Press, as part of a national coalition of 14 newspapers, published a scathing exposé that peeled back the curtain on one of America's most secretive power structures, an underworld machine known to insiders as the Combination, or more bluntly, the Italian Syndicate. At the center of the operation was Detroit, clean on the surface, crawling underneath. 6 dedicated reporters had been dispatched by the Free Press to crack into the layers of local racketeering and its connection to a sprawling national syndicate. What they unearthed was an industrial-scale enterprise, illegal but highly organized, spread across handbooks, numbers games, sports pools, jukeboxes, slot machines, and casino-style dice tables. And behind it all, men whose names were whispered in back rooms and across precinct desks, names like Pete Licavoli and Joe Massey. These were not just local muscle. They had deep pipelines into the crime empires of Frankie Costello in New York and the Rica Capone Combine in Chicago. From coast to coast, they were running the show. And they weren't hiding it either. They lived like kings in Grosse Pointe, flush with legitimate business fronts, insulated by lawyers and distance. These weren't neighborhood thugs. These were industrialists in the crime business. A Free Press investigation laid out the hierarchy. Pete Licavoli, the syndicate's boss, was sunning himself at his ranch near Tucson, dabbling in racehorses. Only weeks before, he had returned to Detroit long enough to get pinched on a numbers charge, still pending. Joe Massey, once one of Detroit's most feared, had relocated to Miami, where he ran a meatpacking outfit called the Miami Provision Company. On paper, he was clean. On the street, he was Costello's man in the South. Joe, Scarface, Bomarito, and Joe, Long Joe. Bomarito, no relation, acted as Licavoli's enforcers in the numbers game. Long Joe had even married Licavoli's sister, Mamie, in a showy ceremony at the Hotel Book Cadillac back in 1946. Mike Rubino was the syndicate's operations chief hands in everything. Pete Corrado, called the police chief of the outfit, enforced discipline. He had fled to Florida when police wanted to question him about a rope-killing Jack George, a known shakedown artist. Not even a safe stolen from his own house was enough to lure him back to Detroit. Then there were the soldiers, Larry and James Sparky Corrado, Pete's cousins, both bruisers. Sam Lucido was battling a numbers conviction before the Michigan Supreme Court, aided by men like George Massou and Moses Joseph, who helped run his numbers circuit. The report named dozens of operatives. Angelo Mealy, the slot machine boss, ran coin-operated machines and jukeboxes with his brother Frank and son Vincent. When rival jukeboxes showed up in bars, the Maleys didn't complain. They bombed the competition. Police pointed to a rash of stink bombs lobbing into establishments that had dared to use other vendors. Tony Terramine, Maxie Stearns, Dave Feldman, and Marty Thomas ran the handbook operations. Terramine was the final authority on who could book bets and who couldn't. The Giacalone brothers, Vito, Billy, and Tony, were the quiet office men, handling the books, the bets, and the breakdowns. At the top of the pyramid were 2 names from the Prohibition days, Black Bill Tocco and Joe Zerilli, old world bosses turned quiet neighbors in Grosse Pointe Park. Officially retired, unofficially still in control. The outfit was divided into 2 major factions. The Licavoli Bomarito group controlled the Chesterfield house. The Massey Corrado camp ran the Murphy house. Everything else, every bookie, every dice game, every jukebox, operated under a unified banner. A syndicate, through and through. The numbers racket tied into football and baseball pools. Slot machines were largely under wraps. Police had cracked down. But there were still whispers. Last summer, 23 brand new machines were seized from a novelty company after an officer found the door open. A mistake, maybe, but maybe a sign the slots were making a comeback. The heat was spreading. The Associated Press reported that the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, led by Senator Estes Kefauver, had turned its eyes to the Hazel Park Racing Association outside Detroit. The committee suspected that underworld money had quietly seeped into the racetrack business. Undercover investments that masked familiar names from the Prohibition era. At the heart of the probe were three men. Anthony Zerilli, son of Joe Zerilli, the retired gangster from Grosse Pointe. Anthony had bought in for $55,000. Agostino Orlando, son-in-law of the once notorious Santo, Sam Perrone, had staked $82,500. Benjamin Retty, whose $2,500 investment raised red flags because investigators believed he was connected to Joe Retty, a gambling boss out of Toledo, Ohio. None of the men had criminal records. On paper, they were clean. But to Kefauver's team, that only meant the paper wasn't telling the full story. The spotlight swung onto Detroit. The Kefauver Crime Investigating Committee had rolled into town, and the wreckage they were digging through reached all the way to the doors of the Ford Motor Company. First up was Harry Herbert Bennett, once the most feared man in Dearborn. He had been Henry Ford's hatchet man, Ford's fixer, the man who ran the so-called service department like a private militia. Now, before the full weight of the Senate, he was under oath, denying it all. Bennett, 58, still trim, still wearing that trademark bow tie, sat with the ease of a man who had stood in bigger rooms with bigger stakes. He claimed he was never the boss of any factory police, said he didn't hire hoodlums, didn't run the service department. All he ever did, he told the committee, was carry out Henry Ford's personal orders. And if those orders involved hiring ex-convicts, Bennett had an answer for that too. Mr. Ford got soft on some of the guys he read about, Bennett said, recalling a 4-time loser in a liquor case. He told me, maybe a lot of guys here at Ford should be up for life. Bennett claimed to have investigated thousands of cases at Ford's request, people looking for a second chance. But when it came to known names, the committee was less interested in Ford's charity and more in Bennett's Rolodex. Did he know Chester Lemaire, the notorious West Side gangster? Sure, Bennett said. Everyone knew Chester. But he didn't know a banana from an orange. He didn't run the fruit stand at Ford. He was in with someone who did. And what about Joe Tocco? Never worked for Ford. His kid went to the trade school, that's all. The committee pressed harder. You seem to know every hoodlum in Detroit. There's a lot I don't know, Bennett shot back. You name 'em, I'll tell you. The names came. Pete Corrado, Joe Massey, Joe Bomarito. Bennett had heard of them, claimed he didn't know them, not personally. Pressed about his ties to gangland figures, Bennett tried to brush it all off as circumstantial. Men came and went from his office, racketeers, judges, businessmen, police chiefs. Some came for jobs, some came to chew the fat, some just wanted favors. He didn't keep records. I didn't keep files. Not when you were working for Mr. Ford, he said. But there were tapes. Conversations recorded in his office, he admitted. For protection. The committee pounced. For blackmail purposes, Bennett flared. You mean I was blackmailing someone? Number. It was for my own protection. Then came the matter of Tony Deanna, a man whose past cast a long shadow. Did Bennett help him get a Ford dealership? I didn't make deals, Bennett said. He came in like a lot of guys. I handed him off to a department head. The committee wasn't buying it. Deanna, they said, had no capital, no experience, and a criminal past. How does a man like that land a Ford franchise in 1931, right after the murder of Chester Lemaire? Bennett denied any plot. I didn't know anything about that, he said. I didn't order anyone to bring him in. I didn't even know him that well. He was a kid when I first met him. When he told the former police chief of River Rouge, Bennett summoned him to arrange a meeting with Deanna. Bennett didn't flinch. He lied, he said flatly. He was full of bulls. Later that same day, the committee turned its attention to Anthony J. Tony Deanna, 51 years old, dressed in a sharp blue suit, looking more banker than bootlegger. The son of Sicilian immigrants, Deanna broke down weeping under the lights. But the tears didn't move the investigators. They came for blood, and Deanna had plenty of history for them to cut into. Born into the same underworld that took the lives of his father and uncles, Sam Gianola, Tony Gianola. Deanna's life read like a Gangland novella. His father had been shot dead on the front steps in 1917. His uncles followed. No one was ever charged. "You never heard of the Mafia?" asked John Burling, committee counsel. "I heard the word. I think it means a tough guy," Deanna said, squirming. "Mr. Deanna, are you the Mafia boss of Detroit?" "No, sir, I am not." His record told another story. 5 months for bribery after trying to fix a murder trial. A couple felony arrests. Bootlegging, sugar sales, salt work. And then, suddenly, banking, trucking, and a Ford franchise. "Did you sell sugar to bootleggers?" "I sold sugar like anyone else," Deanna said defensively. "And were you in business with Joe Massey?" "Number we grew up in the same neighborhood, that's all." The committee said otherwise. Witnesses were ready to testify, Burling warned, that Deanna and Massey ran bootlegging in Wyandotte from 1925 to 1931. Deanna brushed it off. "I don't talk about other people's business." He danced around the circumstances of how he got a Ford dealership, claimed not to remember details, denied that Walter Hancock, the River Rouge police chief, helped arrange it, denied saying Joe Tocco wouldn't let us near the plant, denied knowing anything about any plan to kill Tocco. Burling cut in sharply, pointing out that Deanna had no experience in car sales. "You made $60,000 a year. You ran an auto haul-away firm. You were a director of a bank. You certainly know how to answer questions." Deanna said he earned his place. "We had a good manager. It was a solid business." "You did nothing," Burling shot back. "You got a free ride on Ford's coattails." The hearing reached its emotional crescendo when Deanna was asked to identify known racketeers. He deflected. He joked. Then he cried. "I sold bonds during the war. I love this country. I'd die for it." Burling, unmoved, cut him off. "Mr. Deanna, I think you've gone further toward respectability than any hoodlum we've seen." "I'm not a hoodlum," Deanna said firmly. "I've tried to be a gentleman. I've tried to live it down." Burling wasn't convinced. "Didn't immigration agents ask you for help stopping the smuggling of aliens? Didn't you cry and refuse?" Deanna snapped upright. "That's not true. I didn't have anything to give them." 2 men, 2 stories, both stained with the smoke of Detroit's underworld. One had pulled the strings, the other had climbed out of the shadows with just enough polish to pass for respectable. But under the lights of the Kiefover hearings, neither could hide from the truth. In Detroit, the line between business and the syndicate wasn't just blurred, it was erased. The trail had gone cold in 1955. But on a Friday morning in October 2 years later, the sharp bark of gunfire inside a New York barbershop reopened every question that had once haunted Miami detectives. Albert Anastasia, the self-styled executioner of Murder, Inc., was gunned down mid-shave, ambushed in his chair, a towel around his neck, his reflection the last thing he saw. And suddenly, the bloody puzzle of Charles and Marie Ferry, a quiet couple who vanished from their North Miami home, was back in the headlines. The Ferris had disappeared in the spring of 1955. Their house on Northeast 6th Avenue looked like a crime scene staged for a movie. Blood everywhere, overturned furniture, a parked car left behind like an abandoned thought. But the bodies were never found. No ransom, no phone call, just silence. Charles Ferry, 66, a retired plumber from Fort Lee, New Jersey, had left more than a bloodstain. He had done an $8,700 plumbing job at Anastasia's lavish Palisades estate, a mansion that had drawn federal attention in a looming income tax evasion case. Ferry was set to testify, and then he vanished. In the underworld, there are no coincidences. The Miami Herald didn't think so. Neither did investigators. Neither did Albert Blinder, assistant district attorney of the Bronx, who later called the Ferry case practically the same as a growing list of unexplained disappearances tied to Anastasia's criminal orbit. The common denominator, Blinder said, was Anastasia himself. There was a pattern. Vincent Macri, one of Anastasia's bodyguards, had been shot dead before he could take the stand. Benedetto Macri, Vincent's brother, disappeared soon after, leaving only blood behind. The Fort Lee police chief, reportedly a friend of Ferry and a scheduled witness in the same circle, was found dead in the woods. A suicide, they said. But nobody in the room believed that. Ferry's link to Anastasia wasn't just business. It was personal. Local sources believed Ferry was no ordinary plumber. He was part of the circle. That belief was echoed by Mrs. Viola Sheridan, a longtime friend and regular guest at the Ferry home, who told reporters plainly, "The mob got Charlie and Marie. He was a good friend of Albert." Sheridan, also known as Doris Zinnia, possibly the sister of an underworld figure, disappeared herself for a week following the Ferrises' vanishing. She returned, but the fear hadn't left her face. Anastasia had a known taste for Florida's warmth, but preferred to keep his visits quiet. Unlike the more flamboyant dons of Miami Beach, he stayed in the shadows. His last confirmed sighting in the area came in March 1954, outside the Carib Hotel on 23rd Street, alongside his brother Anthony, Detroit powerhouse Joseph Zerilli, and the formidable William Black Bill Tocco from Cleveland. That corner, 23rd and Collins Avenue, had become something of an invisible checkpoint for the East Coast underworld, the crossroads of men who never signed guest ledgers. The Gulf Stream racetrack was another regular gathering spot for figures like Anastasia, a place where deals were made in whispers. In 1952, he had arrived in Miami under pressure. Rumors swirled that a new faction of the mob, possibly Genovese loyalists, had given him an ultimatum: stay in Miami or else. Anastasia reportedly laid low in the 4,300 block of Collins Avenue, keeping his empire alive from the margins. But the old-school Don was losing ground. His enemies were circling. And so were the feds. By mid-1958, the noose was tightening. In the aftermath of the Appalachin raid, the now infamous mob summit ambushed by police in a sleepy upstate New York town, Robert F. Kennedy, chief counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee, handed Senator John McClellan a list of names. It was a roll call of shadows. 30 Detroiters, tagged not as convicts, but as associates and contacts, who were present or connected to that secretive meeting on November 14, 1957. The committee made it clear. This list wasn't evidence. It was a roadmap. Among the names were the royalty of Detroit's underworld. Long Joe Bomarito, with a rap sheet that read like a war record. Robbery, kidnapping, murder suspicions, gambling. Scarface Joe Bomarito, whose file included everything from extortion to concealed weapons and attempted murder. William Bufalino, the union man tied to jukebox rackets and shadowy labor deals. Angelo Melli, a former Prohibition bruiser turned jukebox mogul. Pete Licavoli, the man with a ranch in Tucson and his hands in everything from Canadian gambling to Detroit slot machines. There were Tocco names, Corrado names, Melli sons and Bufalino partners, even Rafael Quasarano tied to narcotics with John Ormento in New York. The list sprawled. Murderers, racketeers, union fixers, men whose legacies were carved in silence and sealed files. The government didn't need to prove guilt. The presence was enough. The associations were enough. Together, they painted a picture of America's hidden empire, an empire of loyalty and violence, of quiet money and loud disappearances. And always in the background, like smoke you could never pin down, was the ghost of Albert Anastasia, still killing, even from the grave. The room was hot with tension. What started as a routine hearing by the Senate Rackets Investigating Committee had erupted into open condemnation of America's law enforcement failures in the face of a nationwide criminal empire. At the heart of the firestorm, the Mafia, and in the shadows behind it all, the ghostly hand of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, still pulling strings from his exile in Italy. The Senate chamber heard blistering testimony that day. Martin F. Pera, a federal narcotics agent working undercover, laid out a portrait of the Mafia's modern face, corporate in appearance, savage in execution. He suggested that Luciano himself may have orchestrated the now infamous Appalachin meeting in November 1957, a gathering of over 60 mob bosses in upstate New York that police stumbled upon and broke up. The event had lifted the veil on an organization long dismissed as myth. Senator Carl Munt, Republican from South Dakota, didn't hold back. He tore into federal agencies for what he called complete lethargy in acting against foreign-born crime bosses. "These men should have been deported years ago," he fumed. Senator Carl Curtis of Nebraska went further, accusing the Justice Department of bottlenecking prosecutions. "You can't even go after union corruption without clearance from Washington," he said. "That gives a cloak of protection." Behind these statements was a chilling reality. The Mafia wasn't just trafficking drugs or fixing card games, it was infiltrating labor unions, hijacking contracts, and using legitimate business as camouflage. Pera's testimony painted a web of influence stretching from Brooklyn to Palermo, from Detroit to Miami. He described a critical meeting in Palermo, Italy, attended by Joseph Bonanno, Carmine Galente, and Santa Sorge, Luciano's man, in Sicily. Sorge, Pera testified, often met with American mobsters on Luciano's behalf, while Luciano himself remained under tight Italian surveillance. The Palermo gathering, held just before Appalachin, wasn't a coincidence. Pera believed both meetings were synchronized, part of an effort to reorganize the underworld after the violent murder of Albert Anastasia, the feared boss of Murder, Inc., gunned down in a barbershop weeks before. Appalachin, Pera said, followed a familiar pattern. Mafia bosses don't act alone. They answer a grand council, a governing body that meets to divide power, punish betrayal, and keep anyone from rising too high. The rules are simple. Loyalty is rewarded, and creditable performance, such as an efficient killing, is recognized. July 10th, 1958. It wasn't a gun, a tape, or a confession that shook Capitol Hill that week. It was a family tree. The chart, prepared by Senate Rackets Committee investigator George Martin, mapped bloodlines like crime scenes. Unlike Goldfein's gift scandal, which had preoccupied the press for days, this chart told a deeper truth. The Mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a blood-drenched dynasty, a structure as ancient and disciplined as the one that ruled Sicily centuries ago. "This," said Daniel P. Sullivan, former FBI man, and now the Miami Crime Commission's operating director, "is one of the most valuable things this committee has ever done." Martin's work, limited to a 5-state radius, was a revelation. It showed that over half of the mobsters who attended the Appalachin Summit, the clandestine meeting in a quiet New York town that blew the lid off organized crime, were related by blood or marriage. The web extended from Detroit to Brooklyn, from Ohio to Arizona, linking men not just by business, but by bloodline. Martin F. Pera, a 10-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, put it plainly. You don't join the mafia, you're born into it, or you marry in. These weren't just partnerships. They were arranged alliances, sealed with wedding rings instead of contracts. Commissioner Harry Anslinger of the Narcotics Bureau explained what lawmen had long suspected but never proven. The mafia's strength wasn't just in its violence. It was in its secrecy, built on loyalty forged by family, fathers, sons, cousins, in-laws. Every bond tightened the silence. That silence made infiltration almost impossible. No outsider got close. No snitch ever came back. You didn't betray blood. One example stood above the rest. Joe Profaci, the olive oil magnate of Brooklyn and one of the original Dons. He was absent from the Appalachin lineup, but his influence was front and center. 2 of his daughters had married Detroit mob royalty, Anthony Zerilli and Jack Tocco, heirs to the Zerilli-Tocco empire and the future of the Detroit Syndicate. That, the committee said, was representation by proxy. The Detroit crew wasn't missing from Appalachin. Their blood was in the room. Martin's chart did more than link names. It linked crimes. A breakdown of arrests connected to the men on the chart told its own story. 212 violations of firearms laws, 97 homicide arrests, 86 for bootlegging and liquor tax evasion, 78 larceny charges, 112 gambling-related offenses, 32 narcotics cases, 39 for extortion or blackmail, 21 kidnappings, 11 for counterfeiting, and even 1 for impersonating an officer. 741 arrests, more than 10 per man. The family wasn't just close, it was criminal. The committee wanted answers. Anthony Zerilli and Jack Tocco, Detroit's rising sons, were subpoenaed to testify about their involvement with the Melrose Linen Company, a seemingly benign operation now under federal scrutiny. Neither man had a record. But records, as Robert F. Kennedy knew, don't always tell the whole story. Zerilli was the son of Joe Zerilli, a quiet but powerful figure in Detroit rackets. Tocco, his cousin, was the son of William Black Bill Tocco, another old-school Don with roots deep in the city's Prohibition past. On paper, they were businessmen. In reality, they were princes in a criminal monarchy. The committee's chart showed how the families were sewn together. Joseph Zerilli's sister had married Black Bill Tocco. Their son was Jack. Anthony Zerilli's wife was Rosalie Profaci Zerilli, the daughter of Joe Profaci himself. 3 dynasties, united by blood, loyalty, and silence. 12 years after it began, the sound of war echoed again in Detroit, not with guns, but with subpoenas. The Senate Rackets Committee was turning its attention to the coin machine industry, jukeboxes, vending machines, and the labor unions that had become the mob's quiet cash cows. The hearings would revisit the old lawsuit filed by Bilvin Distributing Company against Local 23,814 of the Music Maintenance Workers Union, then led by Eugene Jimmy James, a man who later fled Detroit, claiming his life was in danger. His enemy? He named a half-dozen Prohibition-era gang bosses. One name stood out: William K. Bufalino, who had once run Bilvin, then became head of Teamsters Local 985, the union's jukebox arm. Sources close to law enforcement confirmed Bufalino had been subpoenaed, along with Angelo Melli, a Prohibition titan turned jukebox king. Sam Tocco, relative of Black Bill, and Joe Zerilli were also named. Melli, hospitalized with a stomach ailment, was served at St. John's Hospital, proof that not even illness could shield a man from a Senate subpoena. Another thread led back to the 1954 trial, where Bufalino and 5 others were accused of extortion and conspiracy in organizing coin-op companies and car washes. They were acquitted, but not forgotten. the committee now aimed to uncover what the jury hadn't. In the desert sun of Arizona, Bill Bonanno, son of legendary Don Joe Bonanno, was singing a different tune. He told a reporter the Mafia was a media fantasy, an invention sold through headlines and pulp fiction. But back in Washington, the evidence said otherwise. The Senate had documents, testimony, wiretaps. They had charts that proved what law enforcement already knew. This was no fantasy. Bill Bonanno's marriage was another page in that chart. His wife, Rosalie Profaci, niece of Joe Profaci. Her cousins were married into the Zerilli and Tocco clans. In Arizona, her family shared turf with Pete Licavoli, now serving time after running gambling operations from his Tucson estate. His wife, Grace, was the sister of Scarface Joe Bomarito's wife. Dominic Licavoli, Pete's brother, had ties to the Zerilli family too. They weren't just visiting Arizona. They were expanding into it, bringing with them the same network of loyalty, profit, and control. So, when Bill Bonanno called the Mafia a fiction, it echoed the words of his uncle-in-law Joe Profaci, who once said the press was just a communist tool. But in hearing after hearing, from Appalachin to Detroit, Washington to Phoenix, the committee kept unveiling the same structure. A government in the shadows, an empire built on blood, and a family tree with roots in every American city. For years, the Detroit Underworld operated like a business with no storefront, a network of gamblers, loan sharks, and enforcers that lived in the shadows and thrived off silence. But Police Commissioner George Edwards decided it was time to turn on the lights. In a bold press conference on Wednesday, Edwards laid out a new philosophy: public exposure as a weapon. If the courts couldn't touch organized crime for lack of evidence, then the community could, by knowing exactly who was involved. It's going to be our policy, Edwards said, to expose organized crime to public view whenever we can legitimately do so with established facts. It wasn't just talk. Days earlier, Edwards had publicly named names, including Anthony Zerilli, Vito Giacalone, and Tony Corrado, as Detroit figures with suspected connections to gambling operations and influence peddling in professional sports. What drew particular concern was their proximity to Detroit Lions players, a case Edwards called his first salvo under the new policy. "This isn't about making arrests we can't yet prove," Edwards clarified. "It's about cutting their tolerance in the community. If people think we're serious, they'll talk. And when they talk, we investigate." The blueprint for this strategy came from the fallout of a November 9th gambling raid at the Gotham Hotel on Orchestra Place flashy crackdown that led to a noticeable drop in illegal gambling citywide. Edwards called gambling the treasury of organized crime and made it clear that as long as it thrived, Detroit's syndicates would remain rich, powerful, and politically protected. That same strategy extended all the way to Miami, where, just days earlier, Florida police were quietly trailing 3 familiar names from Detroit's crime files: Vito, Billy Jack, Giacalone, Anthony Zerilli, and Tony Corrado. The trio had flown south under a haze of suspicion. Rumors were swirling about point shaving in the NFL, and Detroit's police had tipped off their Miami counterparts about a possible underworld presence at the Lions vs. Steelers playoff game. Giacalone, considered Detroit's gambling czar, didn't disappoint. He was spotted sitting stone-faced near the 5-yard line, binoculars fixed on the team benches, not the action on the field. His 2 companions, Zerilli, son of longtime Detroit racketeer Joe Zerilli, and Corrado, son of vending boss Pete Corrado, flanked him. Sergeant Charles Sapp, head of Miami's intelligence division, said his team had begun tailing the group on January 3rd, right after they stepped off their flight. But it quickly became a game of cat and mouse. The men rented a tan 1963 Cadillac and, with practiced ease, shook their police tail multiple times, first at the airport, then at the Diplomat Hotel in Hollywood, where they registered under false names. Williams, Sack, and Corter, with fictitious addresses from Detroit. When they weren't dodging police, they were spotted meeting with Joe Massey, a former Detroit mob figure, now enjoying the Florida sun in semi-retirement. The police weren't the only ones paying attention. The NFL, with a team of 16 former FBI agents, had launched its own quiet inquiry into the trip. At the game, Corrado stood out, 280 pounds, cracking peanuts, looking more like muscle than a fan. The men barely reacted to plays, touchdowns, or the crowd's roars. Instead, they rotated their binoculars toward the Lions' bench. "As far as we know," Sergeant Sapp said, "they didn't talk to any players." And then, as if choreographed, the trio disappeared again. They returned their Cadillac, caught the 5:30 p.m. flight back to Detroit, and left town without so much as a footprint. By Wednesday they were gone, and the Miami sun only warmed questions without answers. Back home, Commissioner Edwards continued tightening his grip. Department shakeups, including the quiet exits of Superintendent Louis J. Berg and his brother, had cleared the way for a new kind of police work, centralized, intelligence-driven, and politically unflinching. Edwards insisted all news, especially major cases involving the Underworld, passed directly through his office. Behind the scenes, Edwards boosted the role of the Criminal Information Bureau, expanded surveillance operations, and pushed coordination with federal agencies. The game had changed. Gone were the days of polite denial and deferred prosecution. Detroit's criminals now faced a different threat: visibility. "We're not going to wait until it's too late," Edwards said. "If we can't prosecute, we'll expose. That's how we starve them out. Cut off their money and their friends." For figures like Zerilli, Giacalone, and Corrado, the message was clear. The city knew their names, and now so did everyone else. It began with whispers. A quiet rumor passed from desk to desk inside the Detroit Police Department, then leaked to the press. Some players on the Detroit Lions were too friendly with men whose names carried weight, not in sports pages, but in FBI files. By January 10th, the whispers had turned into headlines. 4 Lions players, Alex Karras, John Gordy, Wayne Walker, and Darius McCord, stepped forward to volunteer for lie detector tests. Their careers, their reputations, their futures were suddenly tied to men like Vito, Billy Jack, Giacalone, and Anthony Zerilli, names more familiar in federal surveillance reports than in a stadium box score. Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards wasn't interested in waiting for the court evidence to build. His policy was now clear. Shine a light, expose the ties, and let the public see the web for themselves. "No charges have been filed," Edwards said carefully, "but these associations matter." The timeline was damning. On January 6, 1963, the Lions faced the Steelers in the playoff bowl in Miami. Watching from the stands, $5 seats, 5-yard line, sat Giacalone, binoculars in hand, flanked by Zerilli and Tony Corrado. Miami police, acting on a tip from Detroit, followed their every move. They were ghosts in tan Cadillacs. They registered at hotels under fake names: Williams, Sack, Corter, slipping police tails with veteran ease. But they weren't exactly subtle. Corrado, tipping the scale at over 280 pounds, munched peanuts in the open. Giacalone barely reacted to the game. Their eyes were on the benches, not the scoreboard. Behind them, a silent investigation moved forward. Former mobster Joe Massey, now semi-retired in Miami, was seen meeting with them. Surveillance photos were taken. The NFL, spooked by point-shaving rumors, launched its own internal probe. Still, no contact was made with the players. No envelope changed hands. But in a game ruled by perception, it was enough. While the Lions story played out in the sports section, the real shock came out of Windsor. That same week, Joseph Valachi, the federal government's most valuable turncoat, dropped a name: Joseph Zerilli. According to the Justice Department, This mild-mannered baker from Grosser Point Park wasn't just kneading dough. He was running Detroit's Mafia. Zerilli, a Prohibition-era beer baron, had reinvented himself over 3 decades as a respectable businessman. Now Valachi, under 24-hour federal guard, told the world that Mr. Joe was part of the Mafia's ruling council. The accusation tied Detroit's crime empire to the 1957 Appalachin summit, to Anastasia's murder, to the unfolding war for control of the national syndicate. Zerilli, contacted at his lakeside retreat in northern Michigan, scoffed. "Must be a mistake," he told reporters. "I've never heard of Cosa Nostra. I've been in the bakery business for 36 years. But Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards wasn't buying it." "It comes as no surprise to us," he said flatly. "We'd like very much to talk to Valachi. He may have some very important missing links." Valachi's testimony hit harder than anyone expected. He claimed the Mafia ran on blood and marriage, on loyalty reinforced through family. His revelations gave meaning to the connections. Anthony Zerilli was Joe Zerilli's son. His wife, Rosalie, was the daughter of Joe Profaci, the Brooklyn olive oil importer who headed one of the oldest crime families in America. And Profaci's family, in turn, was married into the Tocos and Licavolis, Detroit's ruling class of racketeers. Valachi named names: Vito Genovese, New York; Carlo Gambino; Sam Giancana, Chicago; Joseph Bonanno; Raymond Patriarca; Angelo Bruno, and, with deadly certainty, Joseph Zerilli in Detroit. The Mafia responded with fury. A $100,000 contract was placed on Valachi's head. "If we let him out on the street," one federal source said, "he'd be dead in half an hour." As of August 1963, Joseph Zerilli was still denying everything, even as his son was being investigated for underworld ties to professional football, coin machines, and Hazel Park's racetrack. His empire, built in the shadows of Prohibition, now faced its greatest threat not from prosecutors, but from exposure, from informants, from televised Senate hearings, and from a changing world that suddenly wanted to know the names. Valachi, locked away for life after killing a man he thought was sent to execute him, kept talking. And Detroit, its gridirons, jukeboxes, bakeries, linen companies, and quiet mansions in Grosse Pointe Park, suddenly seemed much smaller and far more connected. On August 11, 1963, Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the underworld for more than 3 decades, broke the blood oath of silence that had bound generations of mobsters to the shadows. In a move that stunned federal agents and outraged bosses from coast to coast, he began to spill everything: names, murders, rackets, and the architecture of an empire built on crime. His decision to testify publicly marked the first major breach in the wall of Omerta, the code that had kept the Mafia's inner workings a mystery to the outside world. Valachi knew the danger. A price of $100,000 had been placed on his head. He'd already killed a fellow inmate in Atlanta Penitentiary, convinced the man had been sent to silence him. It turned out he was wrong, but the message was clear. They wanted him dead. Still, Valachi made a choice. He would talk. And for the first time, the American public would hear, in his own words, the truth about Cosa Nostra. He described a hidden nation within a nation, governed not by presidents or mayors, but by a council of capos. Each family ruled its own territory, collecting tribute, enforcing its own laws, and killing when necessary. At the top sat Vito Genovese, a man so feared he could order a hit from behind prison bars and expect it carried out with military precision. Valachi took the agents through the hierarchy. There were soldiers, buttonmen, and consiglieri. There were sit-downs to settle disputes, and there were commissions to allocate turf. Every city had a boss. Every boss had his circle. In Detroit, it was Joe Zerilli. In New York, Joseph Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, and Tommy Lucchese. From narcotics to gambling, extortion to racketeering, they controlled it all. What made the Mafia so impenetrable, Valachi said, was blood. The families weren't just organizations. They were bound by birth and marriage. Nephews, cousins, sons-in-law. Power passed along the bloodlines like an inheritance. In places like Detroit and New York, one name linked to another like a chain forged in silence. The business was brutal. Shylocking, loan sharking brought in staggering profits. Interest rates hit 20% a week. Debtors who fell behind were beaten, crippled, sometimes killed. Others lost their businesses entirely. J. Edgar Hoover estimated that organized crime raked in over $1 billion a year from loan sharking alone. Gambling pulled in even more. By the early 1960s, the Mafia's reach extended beyond street rackets into banks, nightclubs, trucking companies, even bakeries and funeral homes. They used fronts, forged papers, and friends in high places. Some wore suits, others kept low, but they were everywhere. They had turned criminal empires into corporate holdings. Back in Detroit, former police commissioner George Edwards was sounding alarms about Mafia infiltration into legitimate enterprises. He pointed to Hazel Park Raceway, where Anthony Zerilli, son of Joe, was an executive. Jack Tocco, tied by blood to William Black Bill Tocco, held a seat at the same table. Edwards testified that the track was a front, a cash machine for organized crime. But the Michigan Racing Commission, after months of investigation, cleared the racetrack. They found no crimes, no smoking guns, just connections that, for now, remained circumstantial. Meanwhile, Joe Bonanno, one of the original bosses named Valachi, found himself behind bars in Montreal. Canadian authorities had arrested him for entering the country illegally and lying about his criminal record. Bonanno had claimed to own a hotel in Fort Lee, Arizona, a place that didn't exist. American officials moved quickly to bring him back. His name had surfaced too many times. The heat was on, and still the money moved. The Shylocks kept lending, the gamblers kept collecting. Businesses went under as loan sharks foreclosed on owners who couldn't pay the vig. Legitimate fronts expanded. One racketeer in the Midwest was collecting $1,000 a month from a small business, just the interest on a loan. The principal never went down. By the end of 1964, what Valachi had begun with his testimony had become a national reckoning. The Justice Department, the FBI, and the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations now had something they never had before, a roadmap. And the public, once skeptical, now saw the headlines as something more than fiction. Valachi wasn't a hero. He was a killer, but he had opened the floodgates. What followed would reshape how America understood power, crime, and the thin line between the two. By the winter of 1965, it had become impossible to deny. The Mafia wasn't just running numbers and shaking down nightclubs. It was burrowing into the foundations of legitimate American business. On February 14th, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle ran a stark headline: Underworld expands its grip on business. Written by Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott, the report painted a disturbing picture of a criminal empire gone corporate. Across the country, syndicates were siphoning billions from gambling, narcotics, and loan sharking operations, but they weren't stopping there. According to U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau, the Mafia had wormed its way into high-rise real estate deals, using dummy corporations to hide ownership and scrub their fingerprints from the money trail. Entire skyscrapers stood as silent trophies to the underworld's expansion, their leases managed by ghosts. And it wasn't just hearsay. Joseph Valachi, the first made man to publicly break omerta, had given the feds a roadmap. 317 names in late 1963. Since then, the government had identified over 1,500 soldiers, capos, and bosses across the 5 New York families. Estimates now placed the Mafia's membership at 5,000 nationwide, supported by a staggering workforce of some 750,000 outsiders, bookies, runners, pushers, enforcers, and businessmen who knew exactly who was signing their checks. Morgenthau had 3 grand juries working overtime to dig through this labyrinth. One case was about to come to a head. On February 15th, a federal court in New York would sentence 3 men from the Gambino family, including Peter Castellana, a second cousin of the boss himself, for hijacking control of the Murray Packing Company in the Bronx. The charges: fraud, conspiracy, and hiding under layers of dummies. Castellana faced 5 years. The company, a $10,000 fine. Morgenthau's investigators discovered that real estate was just the tip of the spear. These fronts, shell companies set up in the names of clean associates, had become standard fare, not just for mob realtors, but for loan sharks, trucking firms, and construction outfits. The House Banking Committee, under Texas Congressman Wright Patman, was preparing hearings to explore mafia infiltration of legitimate banks. Patman hinted that the evidence pointed to complete takeovers, lock, stock, and barrel. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for the Cosa Nostra. The pressure was mounting. According to Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, federal convictions for racket-related crimes had jumped from 45 in 1960 to over 500 in 1964 alone. The Senate's investigating subcommittee was armed with a new arsenal: wiretaps, financial records, and informants like Valachi. Detective Sergeant Ralph Salerno of the NYPD's Central Investigation Bureau had been saying it for years. The mafia was real, national, and terrifyingly sophisticated. "They don't just walk in with guns anymore," Salerno said. "They walk in with cash, mountains of it. They buy everything, from kiddie parks to pension funds." Even the old-school muscle was changing. "Hoods like Dutch Schultz used to move with bodyguards," Salerno noted. "Today's bosses have a lawyer and an accountant." The murder rate was down. Killings were now strategic, reserved for traitors and power plays, like the Gallo Rebellion in Brooklyn against Joe Profaci. Federal prosecutor William Hundley confirmed it. La Cosa Nostra had partnerships with criminals of every background. They didn't care where you were from, just whether you could make money. And business was booming. Then came May 1966, and the game shifted again. The Kansas City Star published a piece condensed from the Saturday Evening Post that rattled the underworld. The headline: "Panic in Chicago's Mafia." There, in an 8x10 cell on death row, 20 feet from the electric chair, sat Sam Momo Giancana, the cigar-chomping, silk-suited don of the Chicago outfit. A man whose empire had once been worth $2 billion a year, now doing time for contempt. Not murder, not extortion. Contempt. For refusing to talk. He washed his imported silk socks in a prison basin, stared at the walls and muttered to himself, "I won't talk." Giancana's imprisonment was a warning shot. The Department of Justice had changed tactics, using contempt charges and tax cases to break the mafia's upper crust. And it worked. One of Giancana's lieutenants had been sentenced to 4.5 years. Another was awaiting 20. The Cosa Nostra had always counted on 3 things to protect its bosses. First, the maze of insulation. Orders passed through 5 layers before blood spilled. Second, raw terror. Witnesses vanished or conveniently forgot everything. And third, the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment had become the mob's best friend, invoked so often it practically became a punchline. But now, the Justice Department was finding cracks in the armor. Back in 1958, during the McClellan hearings, Robert Kennedy had grilled Thomas Lucchese about a 1928 murder. The widow and daughter had named him in court, they recanted. "I declined to answer under the Fifth Amendment," Lucchese told him. That had been the standard defense, until now. By August 1966, the headlines had moved to Detroit, where the Free Press reopened an old wound, Hazel Park Racetrack. Attorney General Frank Kelly called for a grand jury to investigate doping, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Former Police Commissioner George Edwards, now a federal judge, had testified before the Senate 3 years earlier, calling the track a front for the Mafia. Edwards named 81 mobsters, 3 of whom held stock in Hazel Park. The paper trail led to Anthony Zerilli, who testified that he got the stock at age 21, financed by a loan from his father, Joseph Zerilli, identified as a boss in the Senate exhibits. No one proved criminal wrongdoing, but the stench lingered. In February 1967, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement laid it bare. La Cosa Nostra wasn't just a gang, it was a shadow government. It could manipulate Wall Street, fix prices, and infiltrate industries from yeast to accounting firms. It operated in 24 families, with a ruling council, the Commission, at its core. Names like Genovese, Lucchese, Gambino, and Giancana weren't just mob bosses, they were titans. Even in the Bahamas, the rot spread. Robert Keith Gonsalves, president of Bahamas Amusements, admitted to paying out over $300,000 in political cash to the United Bahamian Party, money funneled through Bay Street figure Sir Stafford Sands. The casino money that built Freeport's empire had hands in everything, from politics to law enforcement. On a bitter October night in 1964, rain sliced through Park Avenue like a razor. At 35 Park, a yellow cab pulled up, and 2 men stepped out. Defense attorney William Power Maloney and his most infamous client, Giuseppe Joe Bananas Bonanno, patriarch of one of New York's 5 families, and a man who had once held the Mafia Commission in the palm of his hand. They were headed in for the night. At 10 in the morning, Bonanno was expected to appear before a federal grand jury, but the Mafia had other plans. As the cab rolled away, shadows moved in. Hoods blocked the entrance. One gunman snarled, "Get lost!" Maloney was pushed back. Bonanno was shoved into a light-coloured sedan and vanished into the rain. No ransom, no note, no trace. The headlines called it a kidnapping. Lawmen scrambled. Rumours swirled. Some said he was dead, others that he'd skipped town to dodge the subpoena. What no one knew was that Joe Bananas had been taken north, to a secluded hideout in the Catskills. A place he'd visited once before, years ago, during the induction of a young soldier named Joseph Valachi. But this time, the trip wasn't ceremonial. It was supposed to be his execution. The order had come from the top. The National Commission had convened. Bonanno had refused to appear. He'd been accused of plotting against the Mafia itself, trying to consolidate power, bypass the Commission, install his son in the line of succession. For that, he was to be erased. The job was handed to Don Stefano Magaddino, the ice-blooded boss of Buffalo, and a man who had once called Bonanno family. But when Joe faced Magaddino that night, he didn't beg. He made a pitch. His narcotics connections were too valuable, he said. His death would split the old guard from the upstarts. And besides, he was still useful. Magaddino agreed, reluctantly, to relay the message. The Commission, wary of triggering a war among the younger faction, allowed Bonanno to live under one condition. He'd retire. He named his brother-in-law, Frank Labruzzo, as acting boss, and installed his son Salvatore Bill Bonanno as consigliere. Joe himself was told to leave the country and stay gone. With forged papers and a suitcase of cash, Joe Bananas disappeared into the world. He travelled through Canada, France, Sicily, North Africa. In Haiti, he struck a deal with Papa Doc Duvalier to run the country's casino operations. He partied on a yacht. He brought in showgirls. He managed slot machines. It was exile, but it was royal exile. Then everything unravelled. Labruzzo died of a heart attack less than a month after taking the reins. The commission bypassed Salvatore and handed the reins to Gaspare Di Gregorio, a man with ties to Magaddino. It was a slap in the face, and Bonanno felt it. Back in the shadows, he wasn't idle. He was building new routes: opium out of North Africa, heroin through Montreal. In Palermo, he met with the old Dons. He cut a deal with Paul Mondolini, boss of the Corsican Mafia. Together, they built a new alliance between the French connection and the American mob. Then, on January 28, 1966, the streets of Brooklyn lit up. Gunfire on Troutman Street. The message was clear. Bonanno was back. He reappeared in New York like a ghost from the past, clean-shaven and stone-cold. He walked into federal court and faced his charges head-on. The commission didn't lift a finger. By then, most of his enemies were either dead, dying, or losing their grip. Joe Bananas reclaimed his family, his rackets, his empire. He held onto the Haiti casino, kept the Montreal-New York pipeline humming. The man they tried to erase had outlived the very system that condemned him. By the time America met Joseph Valachi, the country had already seen its share of wise guys. But Valachi wasn't another two-bit hood or tabloid villain. He was something far more dangerous. He was a madman who decided to talk. It was the autumn of 1963 when his name first hit the airwaves. There he was, a pale, weathered figure under the Senate's harsh lights, telling the world about this thing of ours. Outsiders called it the Mafia. He called it what it really was: Cosa Nostra. Behind the scenes, it had taken Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to force the issue. Kennedy, who had spent years dragging the mob into daylight, called Valachi's testimony the first real break in the Underworld's code of silence. But even then, many questioned it. Was he lying? Was there really such a thing as Cosa Nostra? Or was this just another jailhouse tale cooked up for leniency? Peter Maas, a seasoned reporter with a nose for buried truths, didn't think so. He sat with Valachi, sifted through the transcripts, and came away with something that would eventually become the Valachi Papers, a first-hand account of life inside the American Mafia, told by the soldier who broke ranks. Maas didn't just take Valachi's word. He compared his interviews to FBI interrogation files, raw intelligence, marked up, coded, shipped straight to Washington. Except for a few memory slips, Maas wrote, his story checked out point by point. The facts lined up like a crime scene diagram. Names, dates, bodies, they all fell into place. Even the name Cosa Nostra wasn't something Valachi invented. It had been picked up on FBI wiretaps at least a year earlier. The agents had already suspected it was what the insiders called themselves. Maas described a moment of revelation during one of Valachi's early interviews, when FBI agent James Flynn pressed him, "Joe, let's stop playing games. The Attorney General wants names. What's the organization called? Is it Mafia?" "No," Valachi answered. "That's what outsiders call it." Flynn leaned in. "We know it's Italian. I'll give you the first part. You give me the rest. It's Cosa..." Valachi went ghost white. His mouth stayed shut for a full minute. Then, finally, Cosa Nostra. "So, you know about it." He knew what he was doing. Breaking omertà, the code, wasn't just frowned upon. It was a death sentence, but he did it anyway, and his reasons were personal. Valachi had survived 30 years in the life. He had run numbers, shaken down clubs, fronted jukebox scams, and supervised hits. He'd buried bodies. He'd buried friends. By the time he broke, he was already buried himself, doing life, hunted by his own boss, Vito Genovese. He said he was brought into the organization by none other than Salvatore Maranzano. His sponsor, his Goomba, was Joe Bonanno. Yes, that Joe Bonanno. During the initiation, Bonanno pricked Valachi's trigger finger with a pin. Maranzano said. "This blood means we are now one family." It was a moment Valachi would never forget, and one he'd spend the rest of his life trying to survive. He wasn't a capo. He wasn't even a lieutenant. He was a soldier, the lowest rank in the syndicate. But soldiers see everything. Valachi knew who gave orders and who disappeared when they didn't follow them. He'd been close to Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, a top man in the Genovese family, until Strollo vanished without a trace. Valachi said Genovese ordered the hit. It wasn't personal, it was business. And business, Valachi explained, was always dirty. In his early days, he'd been the wheelman. He drove the getaway car, watched the door, and did what needed to be done. Later, he coordinated hits, planned every last detail. The Justice Department estimated he was involved in at least 33 murders. Valachi never denied it. He just said he hadn't pulled the trigger, most of the time. By the time Mars entered the picture, Valachi had begun writing his own manuscript in longhand, rambling, erratic, unreadable. Valachi's style, Mars joked, made Faulkner look like a guy who stuck to subject and predicate. So, Mars took over. He streamlined the chaos. With Valachi's permission and Justice Department approval, he turned the confessions into a book. But, when word got out, the backlash was swift. Italian-American groups protested, claiming the book would smear an entire ethnicity. The Justice Department caved and pulled support. But Mars kept going. And the deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Valachi wasn't talking about Italians. He was talking about killers, thieves, extortionists, men who made millions off drugs, unions, and death. "What are they yelling about?" Valachi asked. "I'm not writing about Italians. I'm writing about mob guys." He was telling the truth, and for the first time, the public saw the Mafia not as a myth, but as a machine, well-oiled, structured, and lethal. There were 25 to 30 families in the United States, 5 in New York alone. The names behind them were legendary: Luciano, Costello, Genovese, Bonanno, Gambino. And yet most Americans only knew the shadows. Valachi dragged them into the light. There's a passage in the Valachi papers that captures the life, the fear, the paranoia, the acceptance of death as a job hazard. It was the era when Genovese made his move to become boss of bosses. And the air in New York grew thick with dread. It was a bad time for us. Everyone was a little nervous. I felt that at any moment I could get hit with a shotgun blast. I would come home in the wee hours, and it would be very quiet. I would stand in front of my door sometimes and hold my shoulders tight, expecting a blast. But I must say other times I just didn't care. What could I do about it anyway? He'd seen too much to lie, and by the time he talked, he had nothing left to protect. What he gave law enforcement was more than testimony. It was a map, a chart of a world that had always been just out of reach. For the politicians who courted mob votes, for the businessmen who thought they could partner with killers and walk away clean, and for the gamblers who paid into the system every week without thinking twice. Valachi's words were a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw.